Hello and welcome to this presentation on rent and service charges. My name's Mark Cole and I'm Director of Resources at Women's Pioneer, and I'm responsible for finance and IT activities. Over the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'd like to do a presentation on rents and service charges, and the presentation is very much split in the two halves. So first of all, on the rent charges, we're going to cover how they're increased, what does your rent cover, and where does the money go? We're then going to focus very much on service charges, and we're going to have a look at what the service charge covers, how we set the service charges, and we'll look at an example service charge statement, and I'll take you through it so we can interpret it. So firstly, on rent charges, as you're aware, we apply annual rent increases, and for the majority of our residents, we apply that increase in July each year. We do have some residents, about just under 5%, where their rent increases are applied in January, but certainly for the majority, over 95% of our residents, that rent increase is July. Now, in terms of how that rent increase is set, we report to the regulator of social housing, and it's the regulator, in accordance with agreement with the government, that sets the annual rent increases. And for most years, the rent increase is based on inflation plus 1%. The inflation rate that they refer to is called the Consumer Price Index, also known as CPI. And they focus on a particular month when they're increasing the rent, or certainly setting the mechanism for it. And that month is the September Consumer Price Index. Now, in 2023, the September CPI was reported at 6.7%. And therefore, the rent increases that are being applied in 2024 is therefore CPI plus 1, which is 7.7%. Now, this isn't just Women's Pioneer. This is housing sector wide. So all the housing associations within the London area and across nationwide will be increasing their rents by 7.7%. Why September? Well, that's the particular month the government focuses on, and it's also used as a benchmark to increase other things. So if any residents are in receipt of housing benefit or universal credit, the 6.7% is the amount that it's gone up by. It's also used as a benchmark to increase the state pension by. The state pension increases by what we call the triple lock mechanism, which is the higher of either 2.5%, the September CPI rate, or average earnings between April and July in that particular year. So last year, because average earnings increased by 8.5%, that's the mechanism that's been used to increase pensions, for example, from April this year. So I just want to show you how rents and service charges have moved over time and how the CPI plus 1% generally has been used, but it's not always been used. So we're going back to 2013 here. The blue line is the September CPI rate in that particular year. And then the next line, the brown line then, is the rent increases that we've applied to our residents. So we'll start off in 2013. On the blue line, the inflation rate was just under 3% in that particular year. Rent increases applied, then the following year was CPI plus 1%. And therefore in 2014, we increased our rents by just under 4%. As you can see, the inflation rate then falls, and then the rent increases, or the level of the rent increase we've applied each year, falls again. Things started to change then in 2016. The government announced that all housing associations across the sector needed to reduce their rents by 1% each year for 4 years. So you can see from 2016, 2017, 2018 and 2019, we reduced everybody's rent by 1%. The inflation was still positive, and the impact really on that is our costs were increasing, but our income was reducing. So our margins at that particular time were being very much squeezed. In 2020, we resumed what the usual rent increases were, so CPI plus 1%. So in 2019, you can see that the inflation rate was just under 2%, and therefore the rent increase applied in 2020 was around 3%. Okay, at that point then we started to come out of COVID in 2021. Things started to change. We had Brexit, we've had the war in Ukraine, etc., and inflation started to rocket. And over the course of 2022, inflation actually reached just over 10%, certainly for the September CPI anyway. And that gave the sector a little bit of a dilemma, because we could, in theory, at that point in time, apply an 11.1% rent increase, which wouldn't be particularly fair for anybody. And there was lots of discussions across boards in the sector about what the rent increase should be for the following year. The government actually took that out the hands of the housing associations and says the maximum rent increase you can apply in 2023 was 7%. So the rents were capped last year at 7%, even though obviously the inflation was significantly higher. Inflation has started to come down significantly, but in September 2023, inflation was 6.7%, which is why the rent increase this year is 7.7%. Just showing you what may happen or very likely to happen going forward. Inflation has recently been published at 2.4% in April. If that was to remain at 2.4% for the rest of the year, and certainly when we get to September, the rent increase next year will be no more than 3.4%. If that inflation rate falls any further, obviously there will be then a lower rent increase for next year. I hope that gives you a sense of where rents have moved over the last few years and how things have changed. Okay, so just a slide then on what your rent covers. Okay, so the rent that you paid for us covers the following. So if you need any repairs carried out in your flat, responsive repairs, we will do that. We need to make sure that you have a water supply for washing and for toilet facilities, etc. We need to ensure that you have heat and hot water supplies. Your rent also covers any servicing, repairs and maintaining of boilers. That will be either individual boilers in your flats, or if your building is connected to a communal boiler, it will pay for the servicing and repair of that boiler. We take out buildings insurance to cover the risk of any incidents in our flat. So if there's a fire or a flood, for example, that insurance will cover reinstatement of those flats. Please note, though, we don't take out insurance for personal contents. That is a tenant's responsibility. We then, the rent also covers major works and cyclical decorations to your buildings that happen every sort of 7, 8, 9 years, including things like roof replacements, etc. And your rent also covers tenancy management activities. So your housing officers, for example, if you need to report ASB, if you need to request a meeting with your housing officer, any tenancy management activities, that's covered by your rent as well. If you want to have a look at the key responsibilities, those are set out in the tenancy agreement. That sets out both the tenant's responsibilities and Women's Pioneers Housing's responsibility as your landlord. So a slide then on how the money is spent. So this is very much focusing on 2023 and where we spent the money. So in total, last year, we spent 9.5 million. And the majority of that was invested in our properties. A large chunk of what we spent is on what we call property improvements. So last year we did 51 new kitchens, 83 new bathrooms. We upgraded 52 heating systems and boilers, and we reinstated 3 roofs benefiting 46 properties. So over 20%, that's over 2 million of what we spent last year, was on property improvements alone. The next biggest chunk is around services and then responsive repairs that we have to undertake. And then we also spend a lot of money on what we call planned and compliance works. So health and safety, for example, fire safety, gas safety, for example, testing all the boilers to make sure those are safe. We also have a bit of a chunk up here called interest costs on loans. So you'll see on the next slide, for the last few years, we've actually been investing more in our properties than the money that we've been receiving in. Okay, and that's because we've had a significant number of kitchens and bathrooms to do, and we wanted to make sure we get them done as quickly as possible rather than waiting until those are done. So we've taken out loans to help us invest in our properties, and therefore we've had interest that we've had to pay on those loans. So that forms a chunk. If you include the interest costs and then all the investments in the properties, we spend around 70% of our costs on our existing buildings. Okay, the other 30% then is used for the running of the business. So we have 40 staff in total, roughly, directors, managers, officers, administrators, running the organization. So we've got the staff cost to pay, and then we've got professional costs to pay, the auditors, our treasury advisors, our IT consultants, the office costs, and then there's also the insurance costs as well. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of where we've been investing our money last year. As I mentioned, we spent more than what we received. We received 8.3 million and we spent 9.5 million. And that's due to the volume of investment that we've been doing in our properties. In terms of the volume of kitchens and bathrooms that we're doing, in terms of doing the majority of things, we should be finished that by the end of 2025. We're currently replacing around 120 to 130 kitchens and bathrooms per year. This will probably now be about closer to 50 from 2026 onwards, and will be more aligned in terms of the income receiving versus the cost we're spending at that point. However, the focus is very much now shifting to energy improvements as we look to improve the efficiencies of your flat, so better heating systems, potentially secondary glazing, and we're very much having a good look at what we can do with our buildings. You will appreciate a lot of our buildings in the London area are old Victorian converted properties. We have a lot of properties in heritage areas, in conservation areas. So in terms of, we can't just simply improve the windows by putting in plastic UPVC windows and improving it that way. We have to very much reflect the character of the building. So we're having a good look, like I say, in terms of the type of windows we can do to help improve the energy efficiencies. The regulator will also be increasing its requirements of our minimum standards that we have to apply for your properties, as well as enhanced building safety requirements as well. So we've talked about the rent increases, and that's being applied for the organisation. We've also had inflation affecting our costs as well. So this has very much squeezed our margins, and inflation's had a significant impact on things like our material costs for repairs, leading to higher repair costs. On our cyclical decorations programs, we've tendered for services, and we found that the prices coming back, certainly last year, were 15% compared to 2022. So those went up significantly. We've all felt the increase of the energy costs. We use an energy broker to arrange the best gas rate we can for our communal boilers, and we were paying 3p per kilowatt, and the best deal that he could do at the time, which was a good deal and still below the market, was 9p a kilowatt. So that went up 300%. Thankfully, that's now fallen a bit more. He's managed to negotiate the 2024 contract at just over 6p per kilowatt. So those prices will be coming down, and those will be reflected in the service charge statements. And we'll look at service charges in a moment. Another area that's been increasing significantly is our insurance. This year, they have the insurance has gone up 25%. You may have noticed it personally through car insurance or anything like that. But we've been informed for next year that our building insurance is going to go up 100%. So we've engaged insurance brokers on this one, and we're going to be tendering the service for that to try and find the best insurance rate that we can out there. And then further cost pressures around additional compliance activities required by the regulator and legislation, increasing the energy of our properties, and of course a minimum standard for the quality of your flats. So that's very much the first half of the presentation. That deals with the rent charges, where the money goes, and cost pressures for the organisation. For the next sort of 5 minutes, we're going to look at service charges. So what is service charges? Well, we've talked about what your rent covers. Well, the service charge that you pay covers for activities in the communal areas. Okay, so communal cleaning, grounds maintenance and gardening, pest control, for example. If you have an entry phone system, there'll be a charge for maintaining that. If your building has a lift, there's charges for lift servicing. We have estate compliance officers and scheme managers, where a portion of their salary is recharged within the service charges because they do communal service activities, very much focusing on health and safety inspections of the communal areas and making sure that those areas are safe. We'll also have communal heating charges if we've got a boiler attached to the building, and communal electricity charges. The exception of not having of service charges being applied that don't impact the communal areas is something called personal heating and hot water charges. So if we've got a building with connected to a communal boiler, sometimes not only does it provide communal heating, it also provides heating and hot water to individual flats. Now, in terms of setting service charges, there's two service charge regimes in operation in the housing sector. They're called fixed service charges, or they're called variable service charges. Now, Women's Pioneer Housing operates a variable service charge, and that's made clear in all our tenancy agreements. But we could apply a fixed service charge. Now, the way the fixed service charge work is we will calculate the service charges for the building, divide that up between the residents, and apply a fixed charge in your service charges. And that charge will increase by inflation each year. If on your building we spent less on services than what we charged you, that creates what we call a surplus. And if that was to happen under a fixed service charge, Women's Pioneer get to keep that surplus. If, however, we spent more money than what we estimated, then that creates what we call a deficit, and in that Women's Pioneer would have to cover that deficit. The other things with fixed service charges is less transparency. We don't necessarily have to provide a full breakdown of the service charges, and there's less rights and obligations which residents can challenge on the service charges. But like I say, Women's Pioneer operate a variable service charge. Now, what that means with variable service charges, every single penny that's spent on service charges stays within that, and there's greater transparency. The implications, however, is that charges can go up, they can go down. So what we do is we estimate the service charges for your building for the year. If we spend more at the building, and if it's fair and reasonable and justifiable, that creates a deficit, and that's applied in the following year's budget. That might add to the service charge. If, however, we spend less, that creates a surplus, and then that's passed on in the following year's service charges as a reduction to the service charges. And we'll see the mechanism of that and how that works when we look at the service charge statement shortly. But by operating variable service charges, we need to provide you a full breakdown of the services, both from what we spent last year to what we expect to spend this year, and you have further rights and obligations to be able to challenge the service charges. So just moving on to how we set the service charges, we use a piece of software that we have that gives us a history of at building level of what we've budgeted each year and what we've spent each year on our service charges. So my team will account for all the charges that we've got at building level and load this into the system. And what we've got here is a history of what's happened at an example building there. So we're able to look at the actuals from 2021, what we set, and the actuals in 2022, and the same for 2023. And what happens is my team load the budgets and the actuals onto the system, and I then review it and make sure that what we're charging this year is justifiable. So I'll be able to look at the history of how much things are costing us. Is it a contract cost? Are we able to reasonably estimate that? Is it a non-contract cost? And we have to look at the history of what's happened at the building over the last 3-4 years to arrive at what is a reasonable charge going forward. So we use a system, all the charges are reviewed, they're all signed off, and they're reflected in your then rents and service charge statements. So the last couple of slides now is interpreting a service charge statement. So first of all, I'll split it into two halves. First of all, if we just focus on the top, when you receive your service charge statement, we provide you an analysis of what happened last year. We provide you analysis of what we expected to spend at the building, and then we provide you a breakdown of what we actually spent at the building. Okay. And if we go to the next slide, that carries on, and we have a total. We have a total estimate for the year, and then we have a total actual for the year. And in this particular example, there is a small underspend compared to what we budgeted, and that underspend becomes a surplus in next year's budget, and that forms a reduction to your service charges, and that's passed on to it. If the charge here was higher, that would create a deficit, and that would be a positive figure that is added to the service charges. And we obviously need to make sure that if we're creating deficits, That needs to be fair, that needs to be reasonable, and that needs to be transparent. Let's just go through each of the services now, so you can have an understanding of the services that we could be providing at your building, and how they're charged. So first of all, communal cleaning. So we have contractor cleaners. That is a contract cost. That service is tendered every 3 to 4 years, and we know how much that contract is for the building. So we've set a charge of 5,600, for example, and the estimate and the actual, sorry, is came in at 5,621. You'll notice when I set the service charges and when you get those, we try and use round figures as much as possible. Obviously, when the actuals come in, that's down to the exact figure. That's communal cleaning. Bulk rubbish collection. This isn't contractual. This can be ad hoc. If there is any bulk rubbish dumped at our buildings, we have to remove that, otherwise we get fined. And I'm afraid the charges for those do get passed back through in service charges. So please, if you do see any bulk rubbish, please do report it, and we'll do our best to try and stop that from happening. If your building has window cleaning, that will be window cleaning for the communal areas only. The communal electric repairs, that's repairs to and replacement of the light bulbs in the communal areas. Grounds maintenance and gardening. If your building has communal gardens, we will maintain those. Minor communal repairs. We don't do significant repairs really in the communal areas. If there are any charges to be applied in the service charge, it might be that the notice board is broken and we've had to fix that, for example. Communal contents insurance. We have what we call assets in the communal areas, and those assets are effectively the communal carpet, the entry phone system, the fire alarm system, emergency lighting, etc. And we've got insurance in place if in the event of if there was a fire and that equipment or assets was damaged, then the insurance would cover the replacement costs for those areas. Our older women's schemes have computer rooms, and any computer costs are passed through on those. Some buildings, therefore, moving on to communal and personal heating, some buildings will have communal boilers. Some buildings, those boilers provide personal heating and hot water only. Some buildings, the boiler provides both communal and personal heating as well. And those charges are split accordingly between them. You may have a door entry system on your building, and that's recharged, and the servicing of that is recharged in the service charges. Pest control, removal of any rodents, any pest control issues at the building. Those aren't necessarily contract costs. Some years you can have years where there isn't much pest control problems. Some years there may be quite a number of pest control problems that need sorting. So those costs can go up and down. Again, we look at the history of the building to try and set the best charge possible for that one. You may have a communal TV aerial system, which is serviced. That's applied in the service charges. That you will have, some buildings will have what we call an estate compliance officer, and they will go around making sure, doing regular inspections and making sure the communal areas are safe, and then ordering any repairs that need to happen, for example. Communal asset depreciation. Now what that is, that again relates to the assets in the communal areas. So communal carpets, the fire alarms, etc. And what happens is when we replace those items, the installation costs for those assets are spread over what we call their useful life. So for example, communal carpets, we will spread the life of a communal carpet over 8 years. Fire alarm systems, 15 years. Lifts, for example, 20 years. And the costs are spread over and applied in the service charges over the life of the asset. Fire equipment servicing, those are the contractors that come out and service the fire alarm, making sure it's correctly working, testing the alarms and the emergency lighting, for example. On to the second half of the statement, your building may have a lift, and we will be charging for lift servicing. Your building may have a laundry facility, and we will be charging for the maintenance of the laundry room and the washing machines, for example, in that area. For the old women's schemes, you'll have a scheme manager, again, looking after the communal areas, for example, so there will be a charge for that. And within the older women's schemes, we have what we call a community alarm service as well. So that's recharged as well. You may have a Paladin bin. attached to the building that we have to hire, so those charges will go through sometimes. You may have a communal water supply, and in that communal water supply, we have to do regular testing to make sure that water is safe as well, regular temperature checks as well. In the communal areas, you'll have a electricity supply for the communal areas, and that's recharged in the service charges. And finally, again, at our older women's schemes, if they have a guest room, any income associated with renting out the guest room is not Women's Pioneer does not benefit from that. We pass that back through the service charges as a reduction. We then have a total for the services for this particular building. This is obviously an example statement. And then we apply what we call a management fee. Now, the management fee is looking after the contracts of the services, managing the contractors, and processing their invoices, etc. And that's a generic sort of 15% charge across all the services. And lots of organisations in the sector apply a similar charge. However, we don't apply that 15% to everything. So we don't apply the 15% to communal asset depreciation. We also don't apply the 15% to personal heating and communal heating, because given the recent price increases on that would be giving excessive management fees, and I don't think that's fair. Obviously, in this particular example, we've got last year's surplus or deficit, so they had a deficit the previous year that was applied in the service charges, and as we mentioned, we have a surplus this year. So just going back then, so we have our estimate for 2014 in this example. That's divided by the number of properties in the building to arrive at an individual charge. You have your total charge for the year at the bottom, which is then divided by 12 as your monthly rents and your monthly service charges, sorry, and that's split between what we call communal services and personal services, and that will be applied on your rent and service charge letter. So I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening. Please, if you have any queries, please give us a ring on our telephone number, or do email our customer services at womenspioneer.co.uk with any queries that you'll have, and we will answer them. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found that useful.